name is Mark DeLossi. I am Vice President of Indiana Landmarks and one of the founders of Indiana Modern. We are the sponsors for the program tonight, and this is something that we do throughout the course of the year. Um, it may be that you were most recently at our sold out program in Fort Wayne back in June that was held at the Concordia Seminary and was focused on the Saarinen family that designed that incredible complex there. We had Evans featured as a speaker at one of our annual lectures back in 2010, and which we nicknamed that weekend of events the Woollen Palooza, which he was most delighted with that that naming. And I'm certain, as I said earlier, that he would be thrilled at all of yours collective interest in the program and on this, the first biography of his works that we're going to be focused on this evening when you hear from the authors. I mentioned that we do have some folks tonight listening on Zoom. And if you are participating tonight via Zoom and you have a question for our speakers, please be sure to enter that in chat or the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can during the question and answer period. Since 2005, Indiana Modern has educated and informed the public about the importance of modern architecture and design in the state and advocated for preservation of buildings and landscapes of the 20th century. We accomplish that work through advocacy, technical assistance, tours, grants, and educational programming, such as tonight's lecture. Just a reminder that this evening includes an opportunity to purchase the Woollen biography. Many of you may have already done that on the way in. It is a richly illustrated book, and I would encourage you all to get a copy. There will be a book signing after tonight's program, so you can meet the authors and get their signature as you purchase a book. The thing that I've always appreciated about the designs of Evans Woollen is that they evoke a response. You either love his buildings or you may hate the buildings or you may feel joyful in his buildings. But he was definitely committed to a vision with a purpose. A prime example for me is the Minton Capehart Federal Building that I know when I first came to Indianapolis in 2003, there didn't seem to be much appreciation for a brutalist building plunked down in the middle of downtown Indianapolis in the way it was. And there was a lot of grumbling that you would hear about and derision about the building. But I would certainly say that it has gained in appreciation over time and that people understand its design much better. It's even been listed in the National Register of Historic Places by the federal government. There are in the book, I just want to point out, because I found these particularly appreciative, there's some spectacular photos of the Milton Glacier murals that are found on the Minton Capehart building. So just another reason to look at purchasing the book tonight. Well, I'm thrilled to have the authors and photographers, Phillip Cox and Niall Cronin, with us this evening to discuss the legacy of Woollen's works. Phil is a writer and a native Hoosier. He now lives in New York City, where he previously worked for the design firm Pentagram. Niall, is a photographer based in New York City. He is born in Indianapolis, and his work has been shown at the Indianapolis Museum of Contemporary Art and the Edington Gallery. He has been published in the Financial Times, Fast Company, and Time Out. Please join me in welcoming Phillip and Niall to the stage.
Thank you very much. So we're really excited to be here. Thank you, Mark, for putting all this together. in this amazing space and for all that Landmarks does. Um, I guess, a few more thank yous because this is kind of the culmination of 5 years of work on this project. So it's sort of an out of body experience to be here tonight. So we want to thank some of the people who made all this possible. First off is our publisher, IU Press, Dan Chrisman, who really took a chance on this idea. We also want to thank some of the folks we interviewed for this book, about 40 friends, colleagues, former employees of Woollen, in particular Kevin Hughes, who I'm not sure is here tonight, but was really a champion of this idea and a supporter of us from the start. He's the former CEO of Woollen, Molson and Partners. Also want to thank Richard McCoy, who's been a huge help to us from Landmark Columbus, and our friends at Indiana Historical Society. We think we are the first to really mine the Woollen Institutional Archive, which is at the Historical Society, and they put up with a lot of requests from us over the last year, so we want to thank them as well. And the final thing I'll say is, I don't know if any of the folks are here tonight. We're working on an exhibition about some of this work for the Heron School of Art, which will hopefully open next year. So if you like what you hear today, please come talk to us, learn more, keep in touch. We'd love to keep the conversation going and kind of continuing to talk about modern architecture in Indianapolis. All right. So as Mark said, I'm Phil Cox, joined by Niall Cronin. We're going to do like a tag team presentation. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes about the project and how it came to be and a little bit of kind of historical scene setting, and then pass it to Niall, who will go through the photography and really go deep on the individual buildings, which is kind of the heart of the book. As Mark mentioned, both of us born and raised in Indianapolis. This is like our love letter to the city. But I will say, and I'm, curious about the crowd here tonight, we did not know who Evans Woollen was growing up. We knew his buildings, we lived around them, we saw them and kind of quizzically looked at them, but we didn't know the man. And most importantly, we didn't know kind of the story behind them. This project began very organically. It's just a personal curiosity during COVID, walking around an empty city, looking at these striking, bewildering buildings in some cases, and wondering what was going on there. What were the ideas, the philosophies behind them, and why couldn't I find any information about them online? Um, we started logging all these buildings that were all built by the same guy with a funny first name, Evans Woollen. And not only were they some of the most like iconic, influential, identifiable buildings in the city, they were all by the same person. So a pretty remarkable, deep portfolio of work that spanned, 5, 6 decades and many, many styles, typologies. Some of these, obviously, many others were discoveries we made as part of our research and kind of much more off the beaten path. Woollen was known as the Dean of Indiana Architects during his lifetime. When he passed in 2016, his obituary in the Star read, "If there's one man mostly responsible for what Indianapolis looks like today, it would be Evans Woollen." To us, this was shocking. We had never heard of this person. And as we dug in more, we thought there was surprisingly little writing about him, both here locally and nationally. He really had a career we thought of national significance. What writing we could find was mostly, as Mark kind of alluded to, the controversy and the controversial nature of a lot of his work. But we felt there was an important story here to be told. And it's our thesis, at least, that if you want to understand modern Indianapolis and how it looks and works today, you need to understand Evans Woollen. His legacy is still very much present with us, and in the buildings he left behind. So while as much as this is a biography of a man, it's also a biography of a city, and a city that was very important to Woollen. He had sometimes a complex, difficult relationship with his own kind of Hoosier roots, but ultimately he was committed to the city's flourishing at a time of post-war reinvention when a lot of things were changing in Indianapolis, when it was kind of embracing a more modern, contemporary, dynamic image for itself. So where did all this story begin? The kind of paradox of Woollen's life is he always had, to us at least it seemed, this insider-outsider persona. Born and raised in Indianapolis, he spent most of his early life outside the state on the East Coast. He went to boarding school and then college and graduate school in the East Coast. He graduated from Yale School of Architecture. And it was at Yale he got his first taste of what would kind of define his career, which is modern architecture. At the time, the avant-garde, the cutting edge of design practice. It wasn't just any school he was at. He was at Yale, where he encountered the giants of the movement at the time. People like Philip Johnson, who was his direct mentor and later his boss, Louis Kahn, Joseph Albers, sorry. He later got to know Paul Rudolph. So there was a rich history that he was directly related to. And when he moved back to Indianapolis in 1955, he transposed those ideas directly to his own kind of backyard. This was his first completed house upon his return back to the city in 1955. We believe it's the first true international style modern house in the city. Flat roof, glass walls, made of steel, brick, and masonry. You would see this in New Canaan, Connecticut, or in Chicago. This was totally radical for Indianapolis. And it's not surprising that Woollen stuck out. His building stuck out, and he initially struggled to find work, finding clients who were interested in this pretty radical avant-garde vision. We got to know many of the residents of these businesses and homes. Some of them are actually here tonight. We interviewed actually the daughter of the woman standing on that top left corner in the house there. And she said, quote, "You felt special growing up in that house. To have something that beautiful and different and not be a multimillionaire, it felt exotic." One of the joys, but also difficulties of researching Woollen is that he changed styles so often. And a few years later, he moved on to kind of his next chapter, which we would now call brutalism. You all know this building, obviously one of the most famous in Indianapolis, and I would say the most famous of Woollen's career. Brutalism was not a term that Woollen used. He was more attracted to the material qualities and possibilities of concrete. He likened the facade of Clues to abstract art, like a Mondrian painting. This was a luxury theater that was actually made out of raw concrete, unadorned stone, rising like a cathedral from the Midwestern prairie. This was not just, we argue, the first brutalist building in Indianapolis, but really one of the first in the entire country, one of the signal examples of the movement in the United States. If you know Paul Rudolph's Art and Architecture building at Yale, Corbusier's Carpenter Center at Harvard, all completed at the exact same time, so completely contemporaneous with this far less known work. And we think this, is really one of the most significant works of architecture, not just for the city, but for the entire country. Clues put, in a way, Indianapolis on the map based on the press it got, but it put Woollen on the map as well. And really, he was off to the races. It's kind of the building that made the rest of his career possible. He would use concrete and brick and other industrial materials and kind of heroic, bold forms in a series of larger and increasingly more avant-garde commissions throughout the next decades. Each one of these testing, I would say, the aesthetic preferences of what was generally a conservative populace whom he built for. Oops. The other amazing thing about Woollen is he was immensely quotable, and quotes like these are just like too good to ignore. And it's clear to us that these buildings were shocking to many, but Woollen was not looking to shock just to shock. He was interested in the social, the cultural, the civic impact of his work. He felt a real duty to give back to his city in the only way he knew how, which is through architecture. His ambitions during this period were big. He was interested in public work, not corporate work. He was doing less and less houses. He liked shared civic spaces like libraries and theaters and churches that were open, they were dynamic, and wedded to public life in the city. It was an architecture that ultimately needed to be activated by people to be understood. The other really delightful thing we discovered was how much national press Woollen got, an incredible amount of exposure that his practice received across, 4 or 5 decades. No other firm in the city could really hold a candle to the amount of prestigious kind of press coverage that he received. It was rare for a major project not to show up in Architecture Forum, Architecture Record, or kind of these other prestigious trade magazines. For national observers, Woollen was a bold and dynamic architect, a Philip Johnson acolyte, but kind of a novelty, someone who had gone to Yale, worked at the pinnacle of the practice on the East Coast, and then threw it all away to move back to Indianapolis out there and flyover country. And often when those East Coast writers would come to Indianapolis and write about the work, they brought those stereotypes, those kind of biases towards provincialism with them. Woollen sometimes gave credence to those critiques, sometimes he pushed back. The New York Times Magazine wrote a pretty lengthy review of Clues in 1967. It said, "Finally, culture has come to Indianapolis. Clues, quote, has killed the idea that Indianapolis might be Indianapolis." For national observers, Woollen's work wasn't really controversial from an aesthetic or stylistic point of view. It was legible in a very clear way, this kind of long march of modernism through the decades. And there was precedents and antecedents that you could kind of clearly draw the lineage of how Woollen got to where he got. But for locals, that was really not the point. For those he actually built for, there was a different story. His architecture was, as Mark alluded to, often the subject of fierce criticism, particularly these large brutalist works that are the most visible and what he's most known for. They said these buildings were ugly, cold, inhuman. Said one city official of Barton Tower, "I don't know that I have to agree with those who like it just because it appeared in a magazine article." You can see here some clippings from the Star, Indianapolis News. Controversial shows up again and again. We found this pretty important kind of profile of Woollen pretty late in our process. Interestingly, not in the official archive. It was a sort of a no holds bar report on both the pros and cons of his practice. This was the opening line. "The most accomplished, controversial, avant-garde architect is not the most popular man in town." Woollen kind of took, at least in the article, this critique or subtle critique in stride. He retorted, quote, "An architect can't be effective if he isn't controversial." So it's our point of view that in a way he embraced the sort of bad boy persona. He liked and kind of enjoyed being the pace setter for his local peers. But there's definitely another aspect or strain to his work. How a building looked was not really the ultimate motivator. It was not really what Woollen was interested in. It was what a building did in a larger social, cultural, and urban context. You know, he was working in a period of urban renewal, of suburbanization, of white flight. He kind of pushed back against all that and was a champion for a more sensitive rejuvenation of the inner city, often kind of calling attention to the Mile Square plan, Monument Circle, and a regeneration of the downtown when many others were looking towards the suburbs for the future of Indianapolis. He contended that livable, enduring cities didn't happen by accident. It was up to people like him, architects, planners, to help shape the type of city they wanted to live in. Part of our archival research, we uncovered a lot of master planning work that we didn't know existed for some pretty important neighborhoods and kind of quadrants of the Mile Square Plan. IUPUI, areas around Union Station, White River State Park. And while not all these plans were implemented, they represented, I think, his point of view, very much influenced by people like Jane Jacobs, that the hollowing of cities that he saw all across the country, including his own backyard, you know, that was the product of developers or politicians failing to understand what humans really wanted from their cities. Things like connectivity, like community, and ultimately a sense of belonging. So another stylistic pivot, the third act of Woollen's career looked a little bit more like this. And this kicked off in the mid 1970s into the 80s and 90s. It was another about face. If previously Woollen had aspired to be something like the Frank Lloyd Wright of Indianapolis or what Eero Saarinen was to Detroit, now his goals were becoming much more modest, much more subdued. Concrete and bold, heroic forms were giving way to warm plaster, wood, gables, and things like shingles. He said very explicitly that this was a corrective to many years of architects making buildings that were more about their genius and less about the people that they were trying to design for. This is New Harmony Inn, which some of you may have been to. It's probably my favorite building. This was really a watershed project for him and very much in keeping with the surrounding context. So he dubbed this sort of new philosophy something he called situational architecture. It was an architecture that was contextual, it was clearly postmodernist, and embodied what he called the spirit of a place. It didn't shout what it was about, it whispered. Part of this work, the buildings look different because the way they were designed were different. The methodology and the processes he used changed. He became very interested in what we now call participatory design or participatory architecture. Now it's sort of a obvious idea, but at the time it was radical to actually go out and ask people, hey, what do you want from your neighborhood? What do you want from this building that we're designing for you? And he took this to the extreme. He would go actually live with his clients. When he did a master planning project, he set up a pop-up studio in the neighborhood and kind of engaged with residents on their own turf. For this monastery project in southern Indiana, he lived with the monks for 2 weeks to really understand how they kind of went about their day, starting prayer at 5 a.m. and going through their chores and their devotions. This all informed his final design. After Clues, this is probably his second most famous work in the city, though it's pretty hidden today if you drive by the museum. But this embodied his new kind of philosophy of situational architecture. It was a more humanist approach. This is a building that welcomed you. It felt personal, it felt unique, but it ultimately made you smile. Unfortunately, Woollen's story doesn't have the happiest of endings. And as many of you probably know, his last major project was the Central Library Edition in downtown Indianapolis. This was really the swan song to his city. It was a project he was immensely excited by, more or less sort of came out of retirement for. Unfortunately, the project was mired in construction issues, budget overruns, not, I think, due to his negligence, but it was a painful sort of asterisk to what was a, multi-decade career of significance. Today, this building is a huge success, one of the most beloved civic spaces in Indianapolis. But it kind of was a tough place to end one's career. By the time it opened in 2007, he had more or less kind of left architecture behind, moved out of Indianapolis as a result. And this is one of his last projects. This is a vacation home and kind of painter's studio that he built for himself in Colorado. And that's him in the photo. So I'll pass it to Niall in a second, but just some last questions of kind of what is the meaning we should take from Woollen's architecture today? How should we understand these buildings? Why, if at all, are they worth saving, preserving, or at least maybe considering with a bit more thoughtfulness? We're not here advocating that Woollen was, the world's greatest architect or every one of his buildings needs to be preserved. They are artifacts of their time, works of mid-century modernism that embodied a specific moment of post-war American optimism, a kind of optimism that feels very out of sync with the world we live in today. But we do see his buildings as kind of serving a different purpose. They were ultimately these open frameworks, frameworks that had to be filled in by people for the richness of communal life. They were places where the spatial design and social engagement converged, where countless Indianapolis lived and worked and played and socialized and even worshiped and continue to do so even today. So I think this dedication to communal public life is certainly a goal worth continuing and maybe is even more important than it was since Woollen's time. So we'll give Woollen the last word and then I'll pass it to Niall. In his more or less last public remarks in the city, he addressed some of the controversy of his more divisive buildings in a very zen, sanguine way. Music takes time to experience its full impact, but architecture, I would argue, takes much more time. There can be a factor of slow release. And this kind of represented his idea that a building was never finished. It was never static. It was in this perpetual process of becoming. Its identity accrued in layers, first by its architect, but then by the generations of people, users, neighbors, the public who inhabit the buildings. It's not us that make architecture. It's ultimately the architecture that makes us. Sometimes a building is despised at the beginning and beloved at the end, or the reverse, it must be admitted. I will abide by the end myself. All right, and then I'll throw it to Niall.
Good evening. Thank you to Phil for setting the stage. I have kind of just a show and tell for you tonight. A lot of photos to look at. And I guess I should start by mentioning, kind of reiterating what Phil was talking about, how a big part of this whole project was to encourage people, especially in town here, to consider the built environment a little bit more, to see the city around them with a little more nuance and understanding. And no better place to start than the federal building here. I have a lot of photos of this building. Every time we would make research trips back to town, no matter where we were going, digging through archives or shooting other buildings, I would always stop here just to feel like I was adding to the catalog. Maybe I was, let's see, I was never feeling fully satisfied, feeling like I hadn't quite captured it. Maybe I was drawn to it because of its centrality downtown, but also maybe because of its poster childness for buildings people seem to dislike in town. There's a certain type of magnetism here. This shot was from the late spring, judging by the color of the trees there. But also I noticed specifically the bleachers on the sidewalk, which is a giveaway to me. And a lot of you probably know that this is the parade route for the Indianapolis 500 festival that happens every Memorial Day weekend. Here's a jump back in time, back to recently after the completion of the building, one of the early parades. And you can see the calliope screaming down Pennsylvania Street, kind of an old circus instrument. You see the bleachers there full of capacity with people. And if you look to the far left of the picture too, you can see a white sort of flat iron building with a big 7-Up sign on the roof, which was the studio at the time, the office where Evans and the team worked. But with this photo, I think I'm trying to illustrate sort of the civic nature of the presence of a lot of these buildings downtown, specifically this building along the mall, gives it sort of a civic identity. And today, you have that same feeling, the cultural trail running right by it. You also have the handlebar, which is a different type of civic engagement, but no less important. Just some more views, some details further back and close up, but you can start to see how you can spend a lot of time photographing this building. With the right sun angle, Milton Glazer's color fuses really begins to come alive there. And here it is at night. That's 3 sides of the building all put together there. And even in the daylight, it's not as hulking and brutal as people seem to make it out to be, in my opinion. I like how her jacket there kind of matches Milton. And then here's a fall evening with Reggie Miller and Firestone side by side. Moving up to the north side, a little further away from downtown, but I'm sure a lot of you know clues, like Phil mentioned. Here's the inside, probably the most well-known and beloved building. This is where Phil and I received our high school diplomas, along with a lot of other people. I'm sure many people have been there for that. This project, though, is something interesting that, again, a lot of you probably know, is there was a collaboration with John Johansson on this project. The two of them beat out Eero Saarinen during the proposal stage, and it came down to a fateful interview with the matriarch of the Clues family and the main benefactor of the project, Edith. Some called her the Duchess with affection. As Woollen would recount through the years, quote, "The interview just before us was Eero Saarinen. He had just finished one of the great theaters of the world in Lincoln Center. but he was in a hurry. He was late for a jury to the Sydney Opera House. We later learned from Alan Clues throughout the interview, he kept looking at his watch because he had a plane to catch to Sydney. Mrs. Clues, who was of course a prime factor, probably the prime factor, was annoyed by this. As we later heard, it was the principal reason that Eero Saarinen was not chosen. Can you believe it? We came in after without watches. Here's just a more dramatic view from the side. It gets tough to photograph this building these days. As the college has grown, so do the number of buildings. So it gets a little hemmed in, harder to see, especially from the street. In December 1963, here it is, featured on the cover of Architectural Forum. And then stepping inside, again, a familiar sight for many. Here's an exterior view from Sunset Avenue. You can see basically the same structure, but through time, trees grow, buildings grow, parking lots grow. And there's the lobby. On the left, the original design for the entrance. Thought I'd show this again to show how things can change over time, but it's hard to imagine all the fanfare from opening night at Clues Hall being present in the current lobby. But you see the changes in the carpet. There's been some holes punched out for windows. But at the same time, if you go to the top floor mezzanine level in the back, you can see a small shrine to that original seating and a swatch on the carpet that was spec'd by Woollen. Now, just down the street from Clues, St. Thomas Aquinas. This is designed as a new sanctuary for an established progressive congregation in town. Might be some parishioners in the building tonight. In the time of Vatican II, there was an emphasis placed heavily on a closer connection between the church and its parishioners. Gone was the stained glass, ornate stonework, and a pulpit that set the priest apart from the people. This building was rather Spartan in its materiality and massing. The modernist simplicity also helped the project's bottom line financially. The budget for this new church was about $300,000 at the time. Woollen would say a church is a portion of its people at a particular moment in time. And stepping inside, you're met with what looks kind of like a darker fortress, especially in a black-white photo. It feels very light and soaring inside. You have these strategically placed windows spilling light all around. And there's the altar cross being assembled on the left and a shot by Balthazar Korab during a church service on the right. And there's St. Thomas watching the door. So take a slight detour away from Indy. I want to show a short collection of homes that he designed starting early on in New Canaan, Connecticut. This is the Nail House, one of his earliest homes designed in Connecticut. You can see the international style modernist glass box is kind of certainly present here. And then from inside the house, these photos, we got in touch with Roger Nail, who I believe is the kid on the left there throwing a snowball. He generously sent us a family photo album that we scanned and returned. And I like this shot because you can see up the hill through the woods, there's some horizontal lines. You can kind of make out a house there that's actually the next door neighbor, the Arlt House, also designed by Evans Woollen. But, you know, a similar style as well, until moving back to Indianapolis. Phillip showed this photo already, but again, his first home built in town. You can see the language he's using here. Architectural Record named this project a record house in 1957, which is a prestigious title doled out annually to the year's most innovative domestic designs. They still do it today. Record noted the house's big room concept, which was unusual for the time, and the use of cost-effective prefab elements. Stepping inside. Really beautiful home. And then another house in 1960, the Sylvan Perloff residence. So you see the modernist lines, but it's a step away from the Miesian box and becomes a little more influenced by some Japanese architecture. Inside those walls, there's a courtyard here and some images of the living room. One of the owners was quoted in House and Garden magazine saying, "We didn't want to live in a glass house on view to all the world." So this kind of solves some of those problems, still having those modernist sensibilities for sure. And we knocked on the door one day, and Greg was glad to have us and show us around. So we got a nice impromptu tour. Moving on to the Madison residence, designed for the head of Heron at the time. Sort of, again, there's a modernist scheme going on, but he's moving into a sort of a neo-Palladian, new formalist movement. And a few of these have additions built onto them. So it's not the originally designed house, but the extra buildings were designed by Woollen. And a rather distinctive one, the roundhouse, as a lot of you probably know, known as the Liebman residence from 1964. After securing the Cluse Hall Commission, he was approached by Jordan and Joan Liebman to design a new house for their family. Cluse was occupying most of his time and interest for that matter, but their persistence and openness to new ideas eventually persuaded him. A major source of inspiration for these cylindrical volumes were the Trulli huts that dot the landscape around Puglia, Italy, something he had seen on a postgrad tour of Europe. Woollen would cite Frank Lloyd Wright, Bruce Goff, and also a project he worked on as a young designer in Philip Johnson's shop, the Lucas residence. It was never built, but it featured a collection of circles that overlapped to define the building envelope. There you see a drawing we found of the Lucas house and the huts in Trulli. Stepping inside. He loved spiral staircases in these early homes. Sort of a mezzanine above the living space here. And a second staircase. So now moving on from single family homes to a multi-family building. This is Barton Tower, another one that's probably very familiar to everyone. It's a public housing project along Mass Ave, built originally for low-income senior citizens. I like this shot because it shows all different kinds of buildings. You see the Brutalist Tower, the minarets from the Murat Shriners Temple, the German Renaissance Athenaeum building, and this contemporary, what's known as sticks over bricks housing block in the foreground. So getting up closer, it's pretty tough to photograph. It's quite hemmed in on this densely built avenue these days. But it was originally planned as a tower in the park design with an annex and a sky bridge connecting them. Today, the park is gone, and more housing has been built surrounding the base. But here's what that looked like as a whole complex. Originally just the tower. It was deemed very successful in the time, so there was demand for more units like this. So they expanded with an annex on the right, which is still partially standing today, albeit changed quite a bit. And the sky bridge between with units as well. But the pedestrian experience today is rather compromised, I would say. It's a little dark for the bottom third of the building. Here's the main entrance. feels like a beacon, definitely for Mass Ave, and a sculptural addition to the skyline. And like so many buildings of this vintage and stewardship, the lack of maintenance and repair are constant complaints from the current residents. I just want to add this quick moment, just to illustrate some of the research we did. We came across this brochure from the Japan World Expo in 1970 for the US Pavilion. In it, you'll see a lot of things, and it lays out various installations and galleries from this expo. First thing to notice on the first page is a 1915 Stutz Bearcat on a plinth, designed and built here by the Stutz Motor Car Company. But more importantly was the architecture gallery. It was made up of backlit transparencies hanging all over the room, showcasing various American typologies of the era and past eras. This installation was adapted from an Ivan Chermayeff book with photos by Magnum photographer Elliot Erwitt. And if you look at the left edge of this photo, right in the center is a familiar shape. Zooming in there, is Barton Tower. And this is the photo that was on display. Another interesting find along this process was the Rotts Engineering Building, a similar vintage and style to Barton and Minton Capehart, but on a much smaller scale and different program. We don't know that much about this building, and we're not totally sure if it's incredibly important, but Rotts did collaborate a lot with the firm for engineering needs on a lot of their designs. And it's certainly an early project out on High School Road, just past the Speedway. Simple construction, basic materials. It's white brick with these sawtooth fenestration. You know, it looks pretty dramatic from the road, which makes sense in a car-centric place, acting almost like a billboard. Stepping inside, you see the open workspace, cubicles, of course, but great lighting for draftspeople to see what they're doing. And I got interested in this project, so I decided to go check it out, and I took a drive in June of 2024. Here's the state it was in. Still there, not an engineering firm anymore, but it had been kept up fairly well. Even the landscape, the grass was getting mowed, and then I made a second trip in January of 2025 just to check on things to see if they had changed at all, and they certainly had. There's a rendering there, a sign that had fallen down in a storm. But here's the project now, painted black and added a few volumes onto. It was a little bit of a shock, but I want to include this to illustrate how quickly these things can happen. If this building was altered extensively within the time frame of our research period, demonstrating how quickly things move when no one's paying attention. But we do want to make the claim that we don't want to advocate that all these projects, all buildings need to be maintained as a house museum, but far too often things seem to slip through the cracks a little more easily than they should. Back to some brutalism. This is the Jacobs School of Musical Arts Center down in Bloomington. Really amazing performance space, performance arts building. And it's a work of his that I feel like doesn't get that much attention. Stepping inside. Just a few more details from a view of the stage from the balcony on the sides. A lot of custom furniture and a lot of nice Bertoia spec furniture as well. This building is in great shape. It's cared for with a lot of reverence by the people who are in charge down there. See some details on the outside. Some Indiana limestone slabs, similar to Clues at the top there, and some formwork as well. And at the front, there's this Alexander Calder sculpture that was designed specifically for this project. Moving down to the country, here's the Labyrinth at New Harmony. Philip introduced this project briefly, but it's a very interesting place. I'm sure a lot of you have been there. There's a lot of books about it, so I won't get too deep into it, but mainly to talk about the inn as the town grew into a more spiritual retreat after the sort of utopian experiment ended. There was a need for a place for people to stay, and Woollen got that call. You can see a move away from the strict brutalism and a movement towards more Venturian referential postmodernism. There's the chapel here, another round volume. And this is a model that we saw photos of in the archive. That was an early proposal that never went through, but you can see a lot more squat, muscular version of the New Harmony Inn that Woollen was quoted in a newspaper saying, "I'm very happy it was never built." Instead, opting to reference the buildings in the town, like these granaries and mills. Here's a great aerial photo of the inn. You can see kind of in the top right-ish corner. And if you follow a line down to the bottom left, you reach the Roofless Church by Philip Johnson. So there's a interesting student-teacher relationship here. And if you follow that line even further to the left of that photo, you reach Richard Meyer's Athenaeum, which is interesting that it completes its sort of triumvirate of modernisms in a small religious settlement of about 600 people. Just I don't know, under an hour away, St. Meinrad Monastery. Here's an aerial shot of that. It's this triangular plan kind of offers a physical manifestation of the life's work of a monk. A section to greet and serve the public, a section to contemplate the natural world, and a section to enter the sanctuary. In the middle is a cloister and a refectory. There's a view there with the church on the right and how it connects to the monastery. Sort of symbolic wooden doors that a novice monk crosses when they decide to become a monk. Sort of a portal between a past life and a new one. There's the monk's garden on the left, abutting the cloister and sanctuary, and an old outbuilding on the right, formerly used for one of the trades that the monks participated in. Today it's a hermitage, so somebody lives in there, but they are shut off from everyone else. Here's inside the refectory. And there's Father Harry Hagen. He gave us some great stories and showed us around the place. The connection there with the church and the swimming hole. So then back to Central Library, back to the mall, to Central Library, where we started with Mint and Capehart. Probably one of my favorite buildings, I've got to say. You can see here Paul Cray's original library building as seen in 1937, but built in 1917. It still stands today, mostly unchanged, aside from Woollen's addition to the north. Woollen loved this building, noting that whenever architects from other cities would come to visit, he would take them here to show them how magnificent it was. It's also the second Paul Cray design that he would add on to in Indianapolis. As a young architect, he designed Fessler Hall, a classroom extension of Cray's Heron School of Art. You can see the layers here in conversation with old and new. Just the connection between the old and the new again with this atrium space. And then stepping inside, here's the Great Hall of the Cray Building today. Again, very much unchanged. Here it is at the same time, at the same place in 1917. Only change here is they removed the desk and punched a hole through those doors, sort of on the bottom right, for a portal to this atrium. And today, obviously, a lot of you have been here, but it's a really nice moment of compression and release into this airy space. Helmut Jacobi was a architectural drawer who would make renderings for Woollen on a few key projects through the years. He drew this. Some details of the columns and the atrium, just really an amazing space. And I want to end here with this photo of the north entrance with the, you see a bronze sculpture on top of the doors there. That's a statue by Richard Bach from 1892 called Arts, Sciences, and Letters. And that existed on the old library building on Meridian Street. Here's a photo from, I think 1909. The building was built in 1892. I love seeing the horse and buggies here, really dates it. But it's just a great callback to the history of the city. Here's a painting by T.C. Steele from 1918. And you can see a little impressionistic rendering of the sculpture there. That old library building was torn down in 1967, and this building opened in 2007. I'm not sure where that sculpture was between those years, but I'm glad it ended up where it did. Again, it's a great nod to the city's history, something that feels sometimes forgotten today. And that's our project.
Well, that was outstanding, and you really have done your research. We're going to open it up for some questions and answers, period, now. We have mics so that the people on Zoom can also hear the questions that are being asked. So Brian is there in the back. I will have one as well. So if you have a question, we'll come forward and hand you the mic, okay? I'm going to start off with one. We had a question on Zoom from a Rick Ward about photography and those that you didn't take. So you referenced Balthazar Korab, others. Can you talk about your inspiration and your archival research to find those photos?
That was a whole nother project, and I learned a lot because I'd never really done it before. But yeah, that's between the work that I did with my photography, we wanted to be able to tell a story of through time, obviously. So finding these pictures from construction periods before the buildings were done, and juxtaposing them, you know, that's another interesting moment to talk about is he not only getting published a lot in national press, he would frequently hire well-established photographers at the time. You know, Balthazar Korab, I mentioned, Ezra Stoller shot a lot for him. Numerous Hedrick Blessing people shot for him. George Cerna, the list goes on and on. But yeah, there's archives out there, and a lot of these guys are even still alive. So just a matter of getting in touch with them to ask if we can use their picture. That's the easy way to say it.
Do we have questions?
You reference this a bit in the book, but I wonder if you can expand any more that, you know, Columbus, Indiana, great modern architecture, but yet, and clearly they would have known one another, Evans and Miller, but there wasn't ever any collaborative work there.
Yeah, that was kind of our question over the years we did this. We were just like waiting to to find that connection. And so someone here might know, we're also doing a talk just like this in Columbus next week, so we're going to bring it up there. There is more though to the story. So like you said, we know they had some at least social connections through their wives and through other ways. They both went to Yale, both from prominent Indiana families. The firm did work on a project, a kind of rec center for Cummins employees in the late 1960s. We found the model in a slide. It's in the book. No archive in Columbus knew about it. It was kind of a shock to everyone. There's some articles that came out after citing Woollen as like, oh, and he's even worked in Columbus. Like it was kind of a feather in his cap. But unfortunately, the project never was built. The Cummins employees went on strike. It was a whole thing. And that project was built by another architect in the 80s. There was another kind of moment that he was on one of the Cummins Foundation's architecture programs school lists. So they would, for people who don't know, they would pay the fees for really well-known national architects to build schools and other civic buildings in Columbus. They would bring these lists together and then have the local school board choose of their kind of endorsed architects. Long story for this particular school in Taylorsville. Woollen was on the list. Ultimately, he wasn't chosen for a variety of reasons. But we kind of theorize in the book, like why he was never chosen or why he was not part of the kind of Cummins and Irwin Miller project. He was an Indiana kind of local architect, and the whole posture of Cummins and Irwin Miller was about bringing the best outside the state into the state. So we can kind of understand why he didn't gravitate to Woollen. We also think Woollen, you know, again, there may be people who know more about this, I'm sure, in the audience, but always kind of wish he was part of it, but also kind of eschewed that attention because he really resented people valuing outsiders more than what they had in their own backyard. He would often talk about that in other contexts. So I think there's definitely more to the story, and the journey continues, but it's a great question.
Okay. Did you find in your uh research that he had particular competitors that he was competing with often? Because you mentioned some of the projects that he won and lost. And was there any particular rival that he found himself competing with very much?
Not really. I think he kind of saw himself as a one of one in the city. And maybe for good reason. He had a educational pedigree and experience that no one could really touch. I mean, other firms in that period, you know, McGuire Shook, James Associates, many others that people here will know, you know, we're doing big projects too, a lot of corporate work, towers. But Woollen always kind of cut his own path and was very much interested in kind of the the design sensibility rather than just getting the next big project. So no, I think he saw himself on a national stage often than a local one, but it's a good question. And he was an individual. A lot of those other firms were really defined by collectives as they got more bigger and corporate. It was always kind of the Woollen show. And so that was something else that set him apart.
Yes, I was wondering if you looked at any of his paintings and if you felt like his paintings informed his work.
Another great question. There's a little bit about it in the book. Again, there are people here who knew Woollen, so they can speak more to this. He became hugely into first watercolors and then oil paintings, abstract Woollen paintings in his later life. Some of them were, you know, super totally abstract, non kind of objective. But they often had architectural titles. There was one called After Louis Kahn. So definitely this interplay of geometry, of color, of form. You can see a through line throughout his work and his interior work as well. Like you see the Mac. Obviously, there's a lot of similarities. But the paintings really came kind of later, more in his retirement. So they were kind of responding to architecture rather than the other way around.
A lot of them do hang in the Mac in the lobby.
Yeah.
I think they were donated not long ago. Someone in the balcony.
We're gonna get this one first, then we'll get to you.
You shared his quote. I think it was about buildings being appreciated at the beginning versus the end of their lifespan, with him accepting that his would be more at the end. Did he elaborate on that? And were there architects he respected whose work was more popular in its time?
You're testing us. I think he did elaborate. I think, he used that talk just kind of like what we did to kind of express the thinking behind the buildings that many people didn't get, particularly the federal building. He even called this like, it's not meant to be a pretty building. It's meant to do other things spatially in its kind of context. He had a lot of architects he admired, especially in his later years, postmodernists like Venturi, Michael Graves, he was a friend of, an admirer of. So there were definitely other architects he admired. But I mean, this kind of relationship with Indianapolis was always, I think, a latent tension. I think in the later part of his career, it meant a little bit less to him. He kind of became wiser in his later years. And it's that whole lecture he did, that quote is at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. It's on YouTube and it's really worth watching. It's not a traditional slide presentation. It's just him kind of pontificating for 20 minutes about life and art and design. It's beautiful. And then he kind of goes through some of the buildings at the end, but he was kind of a philosopher. So he was really a pleasure to listen to.
Thank you.
So Nick, if you have a question, but speak up and then we'll repeat it, have the speakers repeat the question.
We didn't find any. A lot of people, we saw a lot of sources that said that Saarinen taught Woollen at Yale. We don't think that's true. If you look at the dates, he came to Yale after. So no, we couldn't. I'm sure they had met. I'm sure, but we never found like a direct relation. And I will say in the archive, there's there's very few letters or kind of personal correspondence. It's really the firm's archive. The letters we did find, like he had a correspondence with Robert Stern, with other folks in town, were from other archives. So that's just was kind of an interesting thing that we had to jockey with.
Anyone else? Yes.
Congratulations to Niall on a beautiful book and a huge contribution to Indiana history and design legacy of this place. I hope this book raises the bar for what's possible. I think it's really kind of overdue and well-deserved, so congratulations on that. The question I have is around that talk that Woollen gave and how designers shape a narrative that relates to art and architecture that helps us define place and meaning of life. And so when you think about this book, and as Hoosiers who now live in another city, what is the lesson overall that you have from this book tell us?
And can you repeat the question?
Thank you, Richard. I guess it's a long question to repeat. The question is about what we think is, I'm already forgetting the question.
Takeaway.
What's our takeaway? Yeah, I mean, just broadly speaking, like I mentioned in what I was talking about, just encouraging people to consider the built environment a little bit more. I think gets lost a lot in a very car-centric city, for sure. There's a lot of change in Indianapolis. You see it there's a lot of cranes up right now, a lot of new buildings happening, a lot of great architects in town. But I think it's worth a moment to look back to see what we had. Still have, and use that as fuel for the future, kind of.
Yeah, I would just add also, like, I mean, you kind of said it earlier. We kind of wrote this book because we wanted to read something like this and we want to talk about this like tonight. So I think like organizations like Landmarks are amazing, but in Indianapolis, there's not a lot of them. I mean, Columbus has a whole architecture culture. Places like Chicago, you know, it's the people are talking about this much more frequently, I think, than we are now. And as Niall said, the city is constantly changing. So we think we need to really understand the past to understand the present, the future, and a lot of these ideas are still relevant. We should continue to ask really tough questions of our architecture and our architects as the buildings continue to go up and the cranes keep building things.
Brian, this is going to be our last one and then we'll wrap up. So he's bringing the mic over for you. That's you.
So Philip, I happen to remember your first architecture project building a bookshelf at St. Richard's. So you really have come tremendously in the years since. But I know how proud your parents would be. So my question actually is, and I kind of think of, how, the Penn Station thing kicked off landmark status in New York. And I was thinking when that picture of the building, you could call it transformed or destroyed, whichever you modifier you choose. But do these buildings have landmark status, or is there some sort of architectural protection for them?
I mean, we have experts like Mark to talk to that. Some are, some aren't. Like Mark said, this building has some. The current political environment, that doesn't mean as much maybe as it once did, I would say. But others, surprising number have been changed, like as you saw with clues, like we think it's been changed pretty radically and not in a intentionally, I don't know, there's not intentional animosity. It's more just kind of a lack of knowledge or a lack of care. So again, another thing we hope to come out of this book is just a baseline understanding of the history of these buildings and why, if we need to change them, let's have a broader conversation about why they need to change. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. And again, like Mark and others in this room can talk much more about that, I'm sure.
I just want to thank everybody for coming. It's been incredible. Thank you to our speakers. The last I checked, we only had 2 books left. They'll be glad to hear that. So you can pick up a card and order one online. So again, thanks for coming.